finish this before we all get hungry. Committee will call our select water meeting to order, and we'll see if state engineer would like to come up and share some vision that he has for this proposed interim topic. Proceed when you gentlemen are ready.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Brandon Gebhardt. I'm the state engineer. And with me is you want to introduce yourself? Sorry.
I apologize, Mr. Chair. Chris Brown, at the Attorney General's office. I supervise the water section.
So, Mr. Chairman, I suggested a conservation pilot program interim topic. I think as most of you know, we're actively negotiating with the Colorado River Basin states, the U.S. Department of Interior, the Bureau of Reclamation, trying to develop new operating agreements to replace the existing agreements that currently determine the operations of the Colorado River. A lot of those current agreements are expiring at the end of 2025 and setting the operations for 2026. So if you hear it, it's the terminology we're using is negotiations of the post-2026 operating plans. That's generally what we're doing. It's the intent of the 7 basin states. I think it's the intent of Department of Interior as well as Reclamation to arrive at a consensus solution and operating plans moving forward. Our presentation will, I think, help describe why that is so important. One thing as we go through this that I think will be paramount in our ability to reach a consensus agreement will be that the upper basin, including Wyoming, being able to contribute to the solution. One way we envision being able to do that is with a potential voluntary conservation program in our part of the basin. Chris, in a moment, will present to you some of the history of the law of the river and bring this forward to the now and where we're at currently. And then I will convey why I proposed the interim topic to work towards a pilot conservation program where we are or aren't in that process and what next steps will be. It's important for you to know that we know and understand we will need public input in order to develop a successful program. This includes input from this committee, our Colorado River Advisory Committee, and the general public. We are planning a robust process with our water users in the Green River and Little Snake Basins to get their input through public meetings, meetings with our advisory committee, and the interim with this committee over the next coming months. We do not have many of the answers we will need to develop a pilot program that will work for Wyoming and our water users now, but we do intend to work towards that. And we would like to have that complete and all the information gathered so that we can take this before the 2026 legislative session. And so that's really the intent of what we're trying to do today. And Mr. Chairman, if it's all right, I'll turn it over to Chris to kind of explain where we are and where we're going.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, again, Chris Brown with the Attorney General's office, and glad to be here to talk to you. Being you're ahead of schedule, I gave LSO the copy of my 4-hour presentation because we got tons of time to get through this. I do have one of those, however, if anybody's ever interested. And so my goal is to hit the agreements, the law of the river primarily that Wyoming is party to, and the rules and statutes and agreements and everything else that dictate the regulation, apportionment, and use of the Colorado River. It's a lot. And so I'm really going to try to hit the really high marks, the really bigger pieces, just to give you a sense of what we're doing, where we're at, what are the relationships between the states. So this is a really high level sort of introduction. I suspect there are some folks who aren't well steeped in the Colorado River. And so I'm hoping to give you a simple sort of explanation with the caveat right up front that it's not that simple. It really isn't. But I'm going to do my best to try to explain it in a way that's understandable. And Mr. Chairman, whatever your pleasure is, I'm happy to take questions as we go at the end, whatever your pleasure is. And so those of you who were here on Tuesday heard a short presentation with regard to all of Wyoming's interstate compacts and decrees. And I want to start here in the same place, because by the end of this discussion, we're in this exact same place. When we're talking about divvying up, apportioning interstate streams among states that share those streams, there's only 3 ways to do it. U.S. Supreme Court decisions, that's the United States Supreme Court original jurisdiction to hear actions between states with regard to interstate streams, or interstate compacts, which is also derives from constitutional authority, and that's an agreement between 2 or more states with the consent and approval of Congress. And these interstate compacts, of course, Wyoming has 7 interstate compacts that it's party to, and those are both contracts, they're state law, and they're federal law. And so when we talk about enforcement of these, they're very unique kinds of agreements and accords between states. And the third way is congressional action. And that really has only ever been done once. I think there's some other slider examples where Congress has acted, but the prime example and the major example is the Boulder Canyon Project Act. And that is something we deal with on the Colorado River. And so as we talk about solutions, as we talk about addressing the problems that we currently see today, here's our options. We can litigate in the United States Supreme Court. We can come to an agreement with our sister states. And if we do nothing, then we risk Congress taking some action. And also, as we're thinking about coming to an agreement between our sister states, we're likely going to need to seek some congressional action in order to put in place some of the things that are being discussed with regard to the operations moving into the future. So again, here's the map of Wyoming's 7 compacts and decrees. And of course, we're in the Little Snake River Basin, which is actually part of Division 1. And of course, the Green River Basin, which is part of Division 4. And, you know, some of these slides I have are more for your information. Happy to answer questions on them, but I want to just fly through them really quickly. Just some information for you folks to have. This is an incredibly important river, is what this slide says, to the Southwest United States. If it was its own economy, it would be the 5th largest economy on the planet. And water drives that economy. That's how important water is to everybody that uses it in this river basin. The main thing I want to focus on in this slide is just showing you the Colorado River Basin. And of course, it's 7 states share water, and then there's 2 Mexican states that also share water out of the river. And what we need to keep in mind is that under the compacts, the legal definitions, the Colorado River Basin includes not only those parts of the structural geographic basin, but also includes those areas outside of the basin that receive Colorado River water. Cheyenne, right? Front Range in Colorado, portions of the Rio Grande in New Mexico, Salt Lake City. This is big. Los Angeles, San Diego, but even bigger is Imperial and Coachella Valleys. And so all of these areas that receive water under the legal definitions also include those areas outside of the structural basin. Here's a more close-up map with regard to the state of Wyoming. And its portion, of course, about 17,000 square miles of the state of Wyoming. It's about a 5th in landmass of the state of Wyoming that drains into the Colorado River Basin. And keep that in mind when we start talking about having to do basin-wide regulation. When you start talking about having to take an action that brings in essentially every single water right in Wyoming, this is the geographic area that our boots on the ground have to cover. And so when the state engineer has in the past and likely will in the future request for additional help, this is what we're seeing as things pick up currently through a myriad of studies and additional actions that we're taking to plan, plan for a future as opposed to just waiting for something to happen. We have a lot of need. We have a lot of folks in this basin who are stretched past their capacity to get some of this work done currently. And so you have within this basin, and there are more water rights, but main water rights, about 2,500 water rights that we would expect that would have to be regulated. Only about 500 of those are actively regulated or regulated on any regular basis now, and we can dive in at some point as to why that is. But you have some portions, like the main stem of the Green, where we don't see active regulation because there's enough water to satisfy the rights that divert out of the main stem Green. We have other tributaries, for example, the New Fork, where we have irrigation districts. They handle the matter themselves. They don't call the state to come in and do their regulation. Boulder Creek Irrigation or Boulder Irrigation District, same sort of thing. Farson Eden area with Big Sandy, same sort of thing. They don't call the state in to do regulation for them. So while the state currently is only regulating about 500 head gates, that isn't to say that there aren't quite a few other water users in the basin who don't regularly see a full supply. And just because they don't ask for regulation doesn't mean they have a full supply. That's one thing I want to make sure is clear. And so this is a very simple slide, but it's designed, my intent is to describe the deal, right? So that when you start talking about the law of the river, you start with the beginning, and that's 1922 Colorado River Compact. And those of you who are here on Tuesday know that the reason the state started negotiating the Colorado River Compact was because of a lawsuit between Wyoming and Colorado on the Laramie River. And that was because the state of Colorado was going to develop some additional uses, some transbasin diversions to take water out of the Laramie River Basin over to Greeley to do some additional irrigation, and Wyoming sued. Folks in the Laramie River area said, well, wait a minute, you take that water out of the basin and that's going to remove that water from our use. And so Wyoming sued Colorado. And the result of that litigation was the United States, and of course it gets sued, or it gets started in the United States Supreme Court. That's where these actions start. There's no district court, there's no appellate court. You start in the United States Supreme Court. And the court in that decision found that when both states follow the doctrine of appropriation, first in time, first in right, then that doctrine is part of what controls the apportionment of the river between those states. So Wyoming won that litigation and said Colorado can't take that water out of the basin to the detriment of the senior Wyoming uses downstream near Laramie. And when that decision came out, it got the western states thinking, well, goodness, we've got these other river basins. And of course, you got the headwater states, primarily Wyoming and Colorado, but Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, some of Utah. If the downstream states are developing more quickly under the doctrine of appropriation, then they have the potential to put all of the water under use and therefore have prior rights and therefore preclude our ability to develop into the future. So that was the motivation behind negotiating the 1922 compact. That was the upper basin's motivation. And in the lower basin, what they were experiencing up to that point in time was floods. The Imperial Irrigation District, which is the largest single water user in the entire basin, of course, had a diversion out of the Colorado River, and the very highly variable and flood-prone Colorado River took out their diversion. And it actually, the river followed their diversion back in 1904 or 5, followed their diversion through the canal and dumped into the Salton Sea in California for 2 years. And so they had this unwieldy river. What they needed was storage. And so you had Imperial increasing its agricultural demands very, very quickly. Upstream states worried that that was going to preclude us from developing later. Los Angeles was growing very, very quickly, looking for water supply outside of the state of California to service its needs. The lower basin needed the flood control, but they also needed the storage because the Colorado River, just like every western river, late in the season, it doesn't have enough flow to sustain uses. That's why we built storage. So we store water when it's available so we can use it when it's not available. So the lower basin really wanted storage, and they'd made some attempts in Congress. And of course, storage or building a dam on the Colorado River is not a financial endeavor that any individual district or water user could carry out. Needed federal money. And the lower basin couldn't get that federal approval until this deal was struck with the upper basin on how much were they entitled to. So you had this situation where they're trying to reach an agreement back in 1922, and the basis of the agreement was the lower basin wanted some certainty with regard to a water supply moving forward. They wanted storage. You had the upper basin that wanted to be able to carve out and have for its future use the ability to grow. Wanted to make sure there was water available into the future for the upper basin. And that is the basic bargain. And so when we think about, and when I think about when we're negotiating now in a very complex world, that basic deal is really what we still really lean on pretty heavily. So I want to make sure that it's understood. So the 1922 Colorado River Compact signed November 24th, 1922. And that first bullet was the main thing that we were looking for. It eliminated the doctrine of appropriation as per that compact. So if you hear folks in the lower basin say, well, we're senior, doesn't matter. We eliminated the doctrine of appropriation under that compact. Now they're stuck with, and not even stuck with, but now what they enjoy is the benefit that they get under the Colorado River Compact. This is something that the states recognized back then, and this is still a very important point for the upper basin, at least, is it, they recognized at the time it was better for the states to come to an agreement, maintain control of their own destiny instead of leaving it to a court or leaving it to Congress to craft a solution. That is still something that's very important for us today. Another important piece, the compact protects present perfected rights is what it's called. And this is a typical characteristic of almost all of our compacts. The water rights that existed prior to the compact continue to be enjoyed, and it's typically the post-compact rights that are subject to the terms of whatever the agreement is. And so here's the basic divvying up. The 22 compact divides the river, and it does it both in a geographic way and in a political way, okay? And that becomes important when we start talking about legal obligations, but it does it in a geographic way, and it breaks it up into the upper basin, which is the gray area here, in the lower basin. So geographically, you'll see in this, there's an issue today with regard to this, where you've got some of New Mexico that's got some of the lower basin in it, some of Utah that has some of the lower basin in it, and some of Arizona that has upper basin land. And so when you start talking about apportionments, that is what was divvied up. And the dividing line between the two basins is Lee Ferry, which is just downstream of Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam. The political divide is the upper division states and the lower division states. So this isn't based on the geography, but it's important to understand when we start talking about legal obligations. So while Arizona is technically and geographically in the upper basin, the legal obligations are to the upper division states under the compact: Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And then of course the lower division states, Nevada, California, and Arizona. Here's just a couple of pictures to hopefully keep you awake a little bit, especially working through lunch. That was Lee Ferry, by the way. So the next thing I want to demonstrate is the operative provision in the compact, but this idea is incredibly important for just about everything we're doing right now. The compact doesn't apportion water. It apportions the beneficial consumptive use of water. So I'm not just measuring diversions and saying that's how much Wyoming gets. I need to be able to understand that when a diversion is made, how much use, how much consumption actually results from that particular diversion. That becomes increasingly complicated when you're talking about irrigated agriculture because you have return flows. Some of that water is going to make it back to the stream. It's a little bit easier for, say, example, Cheyenne, BOPU, when they take their water right out of the system, they take it across the Continental Divide. That is 100% consumptive. None of that is coming back. But when we're talking about irrigated ag, it becomes an incredibly complicated problem to try to figure out, okay, how much did Wyoming use when we on average irrigate over 300,000 acres in any given year? And it's 80 to 85% of our use, and each of those fields is going to be a little bit different. And how do we calculate that? So it becomes really complicated. So the 22 compact apportions $7.5 million to the upper basin. Now remember, that's geographically when I'm talking upper basin. $7.5 million to the lower basin. And then it apportioned an additional 1 million acre feet to the lower basin. And that additional 1 million acre feet is generally understood, at least from an upper basin perspective, to be lower basin tributaries. So all told, the 1922 compact apportioned 16 million acre feet. And we'll get into the problem a little bit later, but just to give you a little bit of a heads up on what that is, it's hydrology. We don't have 16 million acre feet. At the time they negotiated the 1922 compact, they believed, the short period of record that they believed they had at least 18 million acre feet to divvy up. They knew at the time that Mexico was also entitled to some of this, but didn't know what the number was. So at the time they negotiated this 16 million acre foot number, they actually believed, the negotiators believed, that there was additional water to divvy up. There's provisions in the 22 compact that actually contemplate coming back and we'll divvy up the rest later. The problem is we don't even have close to that much water. And that is the cause of the problem that we're facing today. The main provision, the main obligation, Wyoming and the upper division states obligation under the 22 compact is the 75 and 10 obligation, if you've heard. And this is it. The upper basin states will not cause the Float Leaf Ferry to be depleted below an aggregate 75 million acre feet for any period of 10 consecutive years. So during the negotiation, the thinking was the lower basin didn't want the upper basin to overdevelop and therefore prevent water from reaching them, prevent their allocation from reaching them. And so there's this obligation. It was negotiated to be a quantity of water over a 10-year period so that you could even out the drought periods. Because the upper basin, the upper division states, didn't want any kind of obligation trigger because of drought. The only way the obligation should be triggered from an upper basin perspective back then is if it was upper basin developing past its apportionment that would cause that depletion. That's from an upper basin perspective. Folks from a lower basin perspective might say something like, the upper basin has an obligation, an unqualified obligation to provide this amount of water at Leaf Ferry. So that's the 75 and 10 obligation. So as I mentioned, what the lower basin got was one, some certainty with regard to what their water supply was going to be in the future. But what they got was the river divvied up such that they could get federal authorization to get Hoover Dam and to get the All-American Canal. The All-American Canal services the Imperial Irrigation District, some of Coachella. That's what they wanted out of the 22 compact. What the Boulder Canyon Project Act did was give the lower basin the Hoover Dam and the All-American Canal. It also, and this is interesting, remember the 22 compact didn't provide any specific water amount to any individual state, just the basin, 7.5 plus 1 in the lower basin. Didn't identify any specific amount for individual states. What the Boulder Canyon Project Act did was, one, give permissions to the state, because remember, compacts have to be with the approval of Congress, gave permission to the states to go negotiate a compact. And then it said, if the lower basin is going to negotiate a compact, we, Congress, suggest this division of the lower basin 7.5 million out of the mainstream. So this was, in my view, and this is my opinion, and others disagree with this opinion, is that this was just a suggestion from Congress. And we're going to fast forward just a little bit, but Arizona sued California in the 50s, said we need to know exactly what our apportionments are. And that's when the United States Supreme Court made the determination that the Boulder Canyon Project Act actually divided up the lower basin 7.5 million. And so this is what the lower division states are entitled to out of the lower basin 7.5 million mainstream apportionment. When people ask me about Supreme Court litigation, my typical response is, I can't guarantee anything with regard to United States Supreme Court litigation, except they're going to get it wrong. And I say that respectfully. The Supreme Court itself has said on multiple occasions that it's not the proper forum to try to resolve these very complicated interstate water disputes. You states need to go solve them yourselves. But they got it wrong in Arizona v. California, and the result of that is one of the lingering biggest issues that we still face, in that they did not, the Supreme Court, include evaporation and system losses in the lower basin. If you've heard the term structural deficit, that problem is a direct product of the Arizona v. California decision. And that's getting into the weeds a little bit. And we can talk about that more, but the first example you give on what might happen out of a Supreme Court case, nobody predicted this result. You don't know what you're going to get. Even Arizona, when they filed the litigation, this was not their argument. They shifted gears well into the litigation, and this is what the result ended up being. The other important thing to remember from the Boulder Canyon Project Act is that it made the Secretary of the Interior the water master in the lower basin. That means that anybody who gets a contract or anybody who is entitled to use water out of the mainstream Colorado River in the lower basin must have a contract with the Secretary of the Interior. The Secretary of the Interior is also required by the United States Supreme Court to regulate the lower basin in a certain way, in accordance with the 1964 decree. That is an incredibly big distinction between how water operations occur in the lower basin and how they occur in the upper basin, which is, the contrast is the Secretary is not the water master in Wyoming, is not the water master anywhere in the upper basin. The Secretary of the Interior, the Bureau of Reclamation have authority to the extent that they hold water rights and they own facilities. And so that is a major issue that comes up quite a bit with regard to who has the authority to enforce reductions. And in the lower basin, it's the Secretary of the Interior. In the upper basin, it's not. Just to give you a picture of Hoover Dam, 27 million acre foot reservoir. It's the largest reservoir in the United States. Lake Powell is the second largest reservoir in the United States. Here's a picture of the All-American Canal that feeds Imperial Irrigation District. It's got a very interesting and rich history why this came to be. That is a massive canal. The capacity of that canal is larger than many rivers in Wyoming. So now we've got the divvying up under the 22 compact. Now we got to deal with Mexico. And so this is just reminding us the upper basin got 7.5, the lower basin got 8.5. And under the 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico, Mexico gets 1.5 million guaranteed annual supply. That's what the treaty says. And so in my mind, at least, I think the country of Mexico's got the best water right on the river. There is a provision in that treaty that talks about extraordinary drought, but nobody's ever figured out quite how to implement that. We haven't had to, fortunately, because the country of Mexico has been willing partners, at least during this period of drought that we're in, and has taken voluntary reductions. But here's our math. 17.5 million that the base law of the river apportions out of the Colorado River. 17.5 million acre feet. Of course, the problem that I foreshadowed, there wasn't near 16 million acre feet in the river. There certainly isn't 17.5. What the treaty, or what the 22 compact actually did, although it didn't know the number back in 1922, it includes a provision, Article 3C of the compact, that identifies how would the right to Mexico be satisfied. And it says that it's first supplied from any surplus over and above the 16 million acre feet that was divvied up in the states. Makes sense. If you've got more than the 16 that was divvied up between the states, that's how you pay it, with that surplus. If there is no surplus, then the deficiency is equally borne by the upper basin and the lower basin. So under that provision, if there is a recognized deficiency, then the upper basin is responsible to satisfy 1/2 of that. So here's numbers that everybody kicks around in the Colorado River. The first is the 75/10 obligation. The second has to do with this Mexico obligation. So half of 1.5 million is 750,000. So you take 7.5 and you add 750,000, that gives you 8.25. And so when we're talking about 7.5 or 75 million, if we're talking about 8.25 or 82.5 million, you're talking about either just the 75/10 obligation, or you're talking about the 75/10 obligation plus half of the obligation to Mexico. And this is one of the big pinch points between the upper basin and the lower basin. From a lower basin perspective, they would say quite clearly there isn't 16 million acre feet of water in the river, and therefore the upper basin is entitled to, or is responsible for, obligated to supply 1/2 of that deficiency. Somebody in the upper basin might argue that, well, because of the amount of use going on in the lower basin, then there is surplus within that overuse in the lower basin, and that's what should be used to supply the country of Mexico. And so we've got these competing arguments. We don't have an answer. And so we try to figure out ways to work around that particular dispute. This is Morelos Dam. This is the northern international boundary. And I just show this because you'll see in the press how the Colorado River doesn't ever reach the Gulf of California, never reaches the sea. And certainly there's a lot of use in the United States, but Mexico has a guaranteed annual delivery. So here's the river right here. This is a canal. A lot of irrigated agriculture in Mexico. So Mexico depletes all of its water in irrigated ag and other uses in the country of Mexico. So remember, the 1922 compact didn't divvy up the 7.5 million that was apportioned to the upper basin among the states. Wasn't specific amounts given to Wyoming, for example. So instead of leaning on litigation like the lower basin ultimately did, the upper basin decided to negotiate a compact for its portion under the 22 compact. That's what the 1948 compact did, and it does several important things for our purposes. First and foremost, it divides the water between Arizona, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Remember, Arizona is part of the upper basin because it has that little piece in the northeast piece of Arizona is in the upper basin. So it gets some of that 7.5 million acre feet. Doesn't share in the obligation, but it shares in the 7.5 million that was a portion of the upper basin. It establishes the Upper Colorado River Commission, really interesting entities, these interstate commissions. Wyoming is party to several of them. On this particular commission, there's one commissioner from each state. Mr. State Engineer Gebhardt is Wyoming's commissioner on the UCRC. And then there's one commissioner representing the United States appointed by the president. Some folks probably have noticed we have a new president. He fired the last one and still hasn't appointed a new one. And so that was a little bit harsh, wasn't it? He asked the old one to leave because it was appointed by the previous president, which is, it just happens. And so we're still awaiting the appointment of a new federal commissioner. Typically, this commission does business under the terms of the compact by a 4-to-1 vote, which means 4 votes in the affirmative are necessary to get something done. So right now, we only have 4 votes. We don't have a federal chair appointed, so it has to be by unanimous action until we get a federal chair. We would like to see a federal chair appointed soon if we could, I think from Wyoming's perspective, at least. And so when we talk about curtailment, and I'll say this in its easy kind of shorthand reference to people talk about a call. No such thing. From my position, from an upper basin perspective, from a legal perspective, no such thing as a call under the Colorado River Compact, but it's easy shorthand when we're talking about curtailment. What the compact does, and remember, compact is federal law and it's state law. So this is Wyoming state law. And oh, by the way, it's probably important for our legislators to know you can't change this state law because it is also federal law. So the only way this law can be changed is by the terms of the compact itself, which requires each state to agree to the change, each state's legislature to agree to the change, and consent by Congress. That's the only way we can change this law. So Wyoming state law says the extent of curtailment by each state shall be determined in such amounts and at such times as determined by the UCRC. So this body, made up of folks we know, gets to make the decision about how much curtailment each state is responsible to engage in order to satisfy the upper basin's obligation under the 1922 compact. Okay, It's a very important concept. And I just kind of want to focus on this. This is the concept where the state engineer of Wyoming, so Brandon's got to take off his commissioner hat. We now have a finding from the UCRC that says the state of Wyoming must curtail, pick a number just for hypotheticals, 100,000 acre feet in order to comply with the 1922 compact. Brandon then has to take off his commission hat, put on his state engineer hat, go out and regulate Wyoming water use because he is the water master in Wyoming. He's the one that gets to decide how water is regulated to comply with the law. And so we would have to regulate, and what the tool we have in Wyoming is the doctrine of appropriation, first in time, first in right. So Brandon, and it wouldn't be Brandon, it would be Kevin Payne and the hydrographer commissioners that are in Division 4 that would be responsible go to, on a basin-wide scale, start turning off junior appropriators until we satisfied whatever that amount is. So this authority piece is very important. And unless we have that authority, unless we have that finding, which by the way is just prima facie, which means we could challenge it if we didn't agree with it, only voluntary reductions are possible. So Brandon can't without this authority, because this is state law. Without this finding, we are then looking to, as to be part of the solution to the problem that we're currently facing, we are looking to voluntary conservation. We're not looking to mandatory reductions unless and until the law authorizes that to happen. And under the current state of play, in order for that to happen, all 4 upper division states would have to vote yes for that to happen. So if even Wyoming thought the conditions, and I'm not saying this is true, because it's not, but even if Wyoming thought the conditions were such that we should engage in curtailment, wouldn't be able to make it happen if one of the other states didn't agree. So even in 1948, the states understood, in the upper basin at least, that there wasn't enough water to satisfy the 7.5 million acre feet that the upper basin was apportioned. The hydrology had then worsened. You went through the major drought of the 30s. And so the upper basin compact doesn't divvy up that 7.5 million acre feet by acre feet. It divides it up in percentage. So Arizona gets 50,000 acre feet off the top to satisfy northeastern Arizona. And oh, by the way, there's a piece of legislation in Congress that is trying to essentially convey that 50,000 acre feet to the Navajo Nation. And so that is a very interesting, I'll call it, issue that we're dealing with right now. But then the other states may consumptively use, because the 48 compact also divvies up beneficial consumptive use, a set percentage of the remaining water available each year. And here are the percentages. And if there was a full 7.5 million acre foot of supply, Wyoming's right would be just over 1 million acre feet. I included this number. There was a hydrologic determination done in 2007. Of course, this is stale, but back then it said it was at least 6.01. And if that's true, Wyoming's piece of the pie would be about 834,000 acre feet. And so here are just a couple of things to think about. We have to know, in order to know whether or not Wyoming is within or without its legal entitlement under the compact, how much water is available for use each year. And I would submit that under current conditions, that number is almost impossible to know. And so these are just things to think about. Here's your 6.01, but if we only had 4 million acre feet, just hypothetically, if we only had 4 million acre feet of supply available to us, Wyoming's share would only be about 550,000 acre feet, which means we are using more currently than our apportionment. I use these numbers because they're based on something that everybody agreed to, but I'll tell you, since 2000, Wyoming's average annual use is about 611,000 acre feet. And so if there's, and this is an important number to think about, 4 million acre feet, if there's only 4, Wyoming's entitled to 553, and currently we're using about 611. And so it's really based on how much water is available to determine whether or not we are within our apportionment. And I'm not and because there might be folks out there listening to me, I am not suggesting at all that Wyoming is using in excess of its apportionment. In fact, I would argue very strongly that we are not. So if there's not enough water to satisfy, let me flip that around the other direction. If the UCRC were to make a finding that curtailment was necessary in order to satisfy our obligations under the 1922 compact, then that's a curtailment. And remember that the 1922 compact and the 48 compact both exclude present perfected rights, they're called. And so what's at risk in Wyoming are post-compact rights, post-1922 compact rights. And I know, about 75% of our irrigated ag rights predate the compact, but ag is not exempt from the potential impacts of a curtailment because of seconds. And we talked a little bit about those on Tuesday. And we have quite a few diversions in the Green River Basin that rely on free river, which simply means the river's not under regulation, then appropriators are welcome to take as much as they need as long as they don't waste it. They have a water right, they can take as much as they need as long as they don't waste it. And we have quite a few folks in the basin that rely on free river. So we have irrigation uses, not only the post-compact ones, but these that are associated with pre-compact rights that are at risk. Post-compact storage, a lot of our storage in the basin is post-compact. Pear plants, Trona plants, City of Cheyenne. Brandon and I get the pleasure of meeting with Brad and his team quite often trying to solve this problem, and other basin cities and towns. Generally, our industrial municipal uses, there are a few rights that are pre-compact, but the large majority are post-compact. So those are the rights that are at risk if we ever find ourselves in a curtailment. And I guess I'll add this on too. I start talking about the further we get down this road without an agreement with our other states, this is either a curtailment under the compact or judicial curtailment. If we end up in litigation and we lose, the potential result of that is the United States Supreme Court telling us we have to reduce. And these would be the rights at risk as well in that scenario. I want to talk about the Colorado River Storage Project Act. Am I going too slow?
Yep.
I am. Okay, I got to speed up. So the CRISP, and I just want to talk about this really briefly because I think Brandon mentioned and I've mentioned that part of what the Upper Basin has put on the table for participation is not only is voluntary conservation, but the other piece is potential releases out of CRISP initial units. And so I want to give you just a real brief description of what CRISP initial units are. The Colorado River Storage Project Act of 1956 and kind of the evolution of the river was they got Hoover Dam, the All-American Canal, and we figured out what the obligation to Mexico was. And in order for the Upper Basin to develop its portion, to develop its 7.5 million acre feet, we wanted storage. So always part of the deal that is part of comprehensive development, the Upper Basin would get storage as well. And that's what CRISP was. In 1956, major driver behind negotiating the 48 compact so that we could move forward with federal funding to get these facilities. And so it provides two main purposes out of the initial unit is to help the Upper Division states maintain its obligations under the compact, but also to put our water to use. So there's two types of projects that are approved, the initial units, there's 4 of them. There they are. I'll show you a map on the next page. And then we have participating projects in Wyoming, Fontenelle, the Eden and Lyman project. So State Line, Meeks Cabin, Big Sandy, those facilities are also CRISP facilities. And here's just a quick map for you. The biggest initial unit, of course, is Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam. The second biggest initial unit is Flaming Gorge. And so when we talk about using water in the initial units, Flaming Gorge is the target. And it's probably the first target because it's the biggest and it's got the least amount of contracted storage. The priority in the compact is if that water is dedicated to use, then it gets top priority as opposed to sending it down to help with the obligation at Lee Ferry. You have the Aspinall unit in Colorado and the Navajo unit in New Mexico. And of course, the purple things on here are the participating projects in each state. the Colorado River Basin Project Act. So now we get all of our storage. Now, remember when we negotiated the 22 compact, there were no reservoirs on the river. And so you had this obligation at Lee Ferry that wasn't influenced by storage. And so the 68 Act, one thing that it does is describe how the secretary is supposed to consider the operation of the upstream initial units in context of the law of the river. And so it sets out 3 priorities under 602. First, the secretary needs to release half of the Article 3 deficiency to Mexico. So that's something we've talked about. That's 750,000 acre feet if there's a deficiency. And then release enough water for the 7510 non-depletion obligation. And then there's this piece, releases after providing for 602A storage. That can be a whole presentation all in and of itself. Just know that kind of just the framework of this act was, here is how you are guided, Mrs. Secretary, on how to make releases out of Lake Powell to satisfy the law of the river obligations. From 1970 until 2007, it was controlled by this thing called LROC. And before you had full development in the lower basin, and you had more water in the system, this objective release of 8.23, it was either 8.23 or flood control releases. And that's kind of how it went. From 1970 until 2007, we hit the drought that started in 2000. And so that resulted in the 2007 interim guidelines, and that governed Lake Powell releases through the interim, through just a 20-year period, or 25, I guess, year period. Nope, just a 20-year period. And also provided for how shortages would be divvied up in the lower basin. So that's what we're doing. That is the path that we are on currently. The 2007 interim guidelines expire in 2026. And so that 1968 Act requires the Secretary of the Interior to consult with the governor representatives of each state, again, Mr. Gebhardt, in coming up with those operations. How are you going to operate Lake Powell and the initial units? And of course, it is a major federal action. So we find ourselves playing in a NEPA pool. So we've been engaged in a NEPA process since 2023. So the interim guidelines expire. There are a number of agreements that expire along with it. The minutes that we have, which are kind of agreements associated with the Treaty of Mexico, they all expire in 2026. If some of you might remember the 2019 DCPs, they all expire in 2026. And so we are in the process right now of trying to negotiate all of these new agreements to take effect by October 1st of 2026. So not a heavy lift, plugging away. This is just to give you a sense of this graph is storage on this. This dark blue is Lake Mead. This dark blue or light blue is Lake Powell. Just gives you a sense of the drop in storage today. They're about 30% full. And these are all the actions that the states have taken since the drought started in 2000. And you can just see it just picks up, and we're even actually missing the SEIS from 2024 on this graph. But just to give you a sense of all the work that's been going on to try to address the dwindling hydrology since the beginning of this century. So just really quick, what the new guidelines are generally going to include. We're talking about kind of a plumbing document with regard to the guidelines themselves, which is really just the operation of Lake Mead, the operation of Lake Powell, shortages and surplus guidelines in the lower basin, because the secretary has to operate Lake Mead and reflective of whether or not there's enough water to satisfy the lower basin entitlements, coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and then storage and delivery of conserved water in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And I think in the basin, everybody has recognized that conservation of water is going to be a critical tool for both basins as we move forward. It's important that the federal action does not preclude upstream and downstream actions. And so from an upper basin perspective, I read this as code, is that the secretary wants to develop guidelines that will be capable of catching voluntary actions upstream, because the secretary, I think, is aware that he doesn't have authority to come into Wyoming and force any kind of conservation. And so that both the upper basin and the lower basin proposals that we put forward include a voluntary conservation component. And so I'm starting to sound like a broken record. I'm trying to set up why Brandon is here asking for this potential pilot program related to voluntary conservation. Any consensus moving forward necessarily will need to have a voluntary conservation component associated with it. And then also we're thinking that we will likely extend DROA-like operations, learn from past experience, and that is releases out of the initial units to help satisfy the upper division state's obligations. Where we're at in the process, it started in 2023, but last March, the upper division states and lower division states provided competing alternatives. Of course, this again is part of the NEPA process. When you think about the alternatives that are analyzed in a NEPA process, we have since that time, we've continued to work together since the beginning of this year. I think we're meeting with our lower basin friends biweekly, even more often virtually. I think I had 2 meetings today that are associated, not counting this one, associated with some of my friends in the river. In January, Reclamation filed that or issued this alternatives report, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide, just kind of describing the alternatives that they're proposing to analyze. Spoiler alert, they kicked out both the upper division state and the lower division state alternative in that report. So that's been an interesting discussion with the new administration. Here's the general timeline. And so we have essentially till the end of this month to come up with a basic framework. So I think we meet with our friends next week in California again to work on the most recent thing that we've been hammering away on. But we need to have these things in place, a record decision by August of 2026. And when you're talking about the magnitude of the work that needs to be done between now and then, this is a very, very short shot clock. Here's the alternative report. You have this in your presentation. I'm not going to read through all this, but here is what the Bureau of Reclamation is proposing to analyze as alternatives. I'll tell you, Reclamation is currently, they've advised us, taking a look at those alternatives and making modifications as needed. Both the upper division states and the lower division states and others, like the Gila River Indian community and others, have provided input since that report. And so Reclamation has taken a look at potential changes and updates and revisions. So here's the problem. I waited this whole time to get the punchline. Hopefully not everybody's asleep. Our enemy is hydrology. I think Brandon has said this publicly. Our enemy is not the lower division states. Our enemy is not the federal government. Our enemy in this river is hydrology. It really is. And so just to take a look, back when they negotiated the compact, here's what the average was between 1906 and 1922, 18 million acre feet. They thought they had more than enough water to divvy up 16 million between the states. The long-term average during the period of record, 1906 to 2024, is just 14.7. And as we get closer, and they call this the stress test hydrology that started in 1988, it's only 13 million. Since the beginning of the century, 2000, it gets even worse. It is only 12.4 million. And just to think about maybe an easy way, and it's not this simple, but maybe an easy way to think about the math problem is that if the lower basin won its arguments, and the upper basin owes 8.25 at Lee Ferry every single year, and the flow at Lee Ferry available is only 12.4, that's going to limit the upper basin to something like 3.5 million acre feet of use. Currently, on average, the upper basin uses about 4.4. Something's got to give. So we're hitting 12.5 to 12 million acre feet of natural flow. Something's got to give. And there's 3 somethings that can give: upper basin use, storage, or Lee Ferry flow. To this point, what has given is storage. And we're out of storage. So this is what we're wrestling with now. what's got to give. It's going to have to be Leaf Area flow and an upper basin position and an argument that under these conditions, we need to be thinking about what the actual obligation is. Because it's not the state of Wyoming causing the flow to be depleted below 75. So that's the argument. That's the problem. What do we do with this deal that was struck in 1922 under the conditions that we're facing right now? 11.8. This is over the last 7 years. In 2025, it's going to bring that down. So for an 8-year stretch, remember we generally think about 10-year stretches on the river, we're going to be around 11.8. That's the problem we're trying to solve. This is one way to look at potential risk. All the time we get the question, and this is an almost impossible question to answer. What's the risk? What's the risk that we end up in curtailment? What's the risk that we have to reduce our use? And so this is one way to look at it. This is actual flow at Leaf Ferry. This was back under operation of the 07 guidelines. All kinds of folks that were unhappy with how the 07 guidelines operated. But I can tell you through the interim period, we're going to end up at about 823. It's going to be almost exactly what it would have been under Yellow Rock, maybe actually even a little less. And so this is actually a little old. We're in 2024 right now. But this is just trying to project potential releases out of Lake Powell. They could actually be less than this. But this is just trying to project out what the current release regime out of Lake Powell, if it moved forward, if it was only 7 million acre feet, then we're going to hit the first pinch point. That's the 8.25 10-year threshold in 2026 or 2027. So that's the first point where we run the risk of being sued by our lower basin neighbors if their position is we owe half the Mexico obligation on top of the 75 and 10. That's the first pinch point. And then here's the second pinch point down here, 75 million acre feet and 10. We're looking at about 2030. But this is assuming that we can maintain at least 7 million acre foot releases at a Lake Powell. And depending on the hydrology, that assumption is probably not something we want to rely heavily on. This depends on the hydrology. So I'm going to show you a few more slides just real quickly about some things we look at. And so as the Bureau of Reclamation and all the states for that matter, we have models, something called the CRSS, Colorado River Simulation System, that models out projections and what might happen and what ifs. And they've got 5 big hydrology ensembles that have many traces. And now I'm getting beyond my depth. What I want to just describe to you here, we pulled out a couple of traces. I'm not showing you the best traces. I'm not showing you the worst case traces. We pulled out a couple of traces to take a look at that are pretty close to what we think we're going to be seeing as far as a long-term average, what we've seen over the last 8 years. Something around 11.5 million acre feet. This one's a little less, but it really matters in what sequence that hydrology comes in. So what this takes is a hydraulic trace that's in this particular hydrologic ensemble, and it just runs out that hydrology through the period that we're analyzing, which is 2056. And so in this particular trace, it's wet on the front end, then you got a little bit of dry, and then one really good year, and then a whole long stretch of wet. And this is what we're seeing. And we're looking at this if the lower basin were to litigate and win, right? This is Leaf Ferry. If we're trying to maintain 8.25 at Leaf Ferry, this is what we're looking at as far as average reductions over this period, maximum and cumulative over that period. And they're the tall orange lines. And as you can see, and based on this trace that had a really dry back end, as you can see, we hit years in here where the amount of reduction exceeds the total amount of upper basin use. That's the magnitude of reductions that would have to take place in order to satisfy this theory of what the upper basin obligation is. If the obligation is only 7.5, then it's these other lines, and you still see periods where you're over 2.5 million acre feet, just a general rule of thumb, post-compact use is probably 2 million acre feet or less in the upper basin. And so this is kind of just the magnitude of the risk we're looking at depending on what the hydrology is. Take a look at another trace. This is actually more than we've seen, but you start out dry. And this is actually starting with 2023 conditions, so it's actually a little bit better storage at that time, and now we've got worse storage. But this starts out with a few dry years, then it's wet through the middle and then dry on the back end. So this starts out right off the bat. If 825 is the rule, then here's what we can look at as far as average, maximum, and cumulative. We're calling them contributions under this particular graph. And if it was 75 million acre feet and 10, of course, you see what that risk is. And again, we're just showing this for example. These are things that we're looking at to try to assess the risks, the what ifs. There are hydrologies that are much drier than this, where it's just impossible to conceive that we'd be able to handle it in any kind of way. And then there are traces where there's never any reduction. And so what we're trying to do is make sure we have rules in place that anticipate and plan for not only good hydrology, but some of these hydrologies that are projected. And we're seeing these now. Over the last 8 years, this is about what we're seeing. Oh, I'm missing a slide in this one. I had a slide that included in your handout that includes a slide from Arizona. And that was just to show you, and this is a presentation that they made public to their reconsultation committee. They're looking at the exact same thing. What they are presenting to their folks, however, if you look at that slide, and I apologize, I have no idea why it's not on this particular one. But what they're looking at is they're comparing what they would believe we know under their theory of the law of the river, and then comparing it to what they offered. And of course, what they offered is reductions that are quite a bit less than would be required under 825 theory of the law of the river, and then explaining to their water users that, you know, they've made this incredibly generous offer to the upper basin, but we haven't provided something of significance back. And so that's how it's being perceived by at least some folks in the lower basin of what's currently going on. But the positive takeaway from this is that Arizona and the other two lower division states are willing to take a look at something that's not 825, are willing to take a look at something that's not 75, are willing to recognize that the hydrology that we currently face, we need to come up with some rules that work. So I'm sure I went long. I lost track of time, and now it's Brandon's turn.
So thank you, Chris, and I'm going to go off script just for a minute because there were a couple of points that I wanted to kind of follow up on what Chris presented. And that has to do kind of with some of the rights that we have under the law of the river, but also some of the obligations. And the importance of, in my mind, of getting to a 7-state consensus. Chris mentioned the federal alternatives in NEPA right now. This is just my belief, but I do believe that if any of those are the selected preferred alternative, they're going to either require some sort of agreements among the party users, or they're going to require federal authorities to go in and do what they can under their authorities, and largely making cuts in use, delivering less water than the demand is. So in my opinion, if any of these are selected, it will likely lead to litigation. So I do not see a golden goose in these alternatives. I also think that that the upper basin alternative or the lower basin alternative, which weren't included, I don't feel that we're going to get to a consensus on those. We're continuing to work on other things, but the value of a consensus deal keeps us out of litigation, and I think that is huge. We could get to a point where we have no other option, but we're still going to try to get to this consensus deal. One of the things that a consensus deal will do, one of the primary things from my perspective, is that it would likely set aside a lot of this compact compliance numbers. It would just set it aside. Chris mentioned the 75 and 10, the 825. I think a consensus deal would be the surrogate for the compact obligations. And so what we would agree to would set those aside, set that argument aside, set that legal battle aside. So in my mind, the consensus is our preferred path right now. And as part of that, we mentioned that we offered in our alternative a couple of things, the DROA-like activities and a conservation program. That's why we're here today. I think it's important not only to show the lower basin the certainty that we can do something to contribute to the solution, but also if we're going to do a conservation program, we don't have anything set up right now. But I think it's very important that if we're to do that, that we need to do it in a way that it doesn't impact our water users and it's something that Wyoming can live with. So that's the primary reason we're bringing the idea of a pilot program, pilot conservation program to this committee. We talked about the dry hydrology. I'm going on my slide, trying to get back to my slide right now. I mentioned the consensus is preferable to litigation or legislation. Like I said, helped demonstrate our willingness. Chris discussed the short time frame that we're under and why it's important right now. And so where we are in the process right now is we don't have a baked cake to bring to you. We understand that this is a sensitive topic, not only to water law, but also to our water users in the basin. And so our next steps are to continue to work with this committee. We also have our Colorado River Advisory Committee that we're going to be working through the interim with. And then we know, and we are starting to develop a robust outreach to go out and communicate with the public and our stakeholders to see what a program could and should look like. And then I'll just finish this presentation with
We mentioned, I must have put the wrong version on my thumb drive. So in the materials, you should have the last slide that describes what the potential subject areas are. Sorry, on this version of the
okay.
presentation.
Do you have, if not, we can get that.
Yeah.
But that's really where we're at with, particularly with this committee. We started a framework of what a potential legislation could look like. I think this exercise that we're under right now helps us to start developing some of the questions we know we need to address. And then we intend to address that through a public engagement process, as well as in concert with this committee and the advisory committee. So some of the things that we're thinking about as far as a framework for legislation would have a part that discusses the findings, start answering, what is the purpose and need of the program? We've kind of talked about that. Distinguishing our portion of the Colorado Basin from other Wyoming basins, and then to describe the true pilot nature of what this proposed program would be. We started thinking about what kind of a process, how does somebody apply? What constitutes approval? Is it an order? Is it an approval of an application? Is there notice requirements for somebody to participate in a conservation program? Is there an appeal process? Who, how, what could be appealed? Are there application fees? We do know that because it's imperative in all state law that we'll have to address no injury for somebody to be able to participate this. I think one of the nuances to the compact Chris mentioned is this is a consumptive use compact. It's not a diversion amount. So how are we going to measure consumptive use? What kind of a historical period are we going to look back on to determine that? What's going to be eligible? What are the considerations for return flows? What losses, conveyance losses are associated with this? I want to be clear on one thing that we are not seeking right now. I think it's just too much of a lift at this point. And we're working on a host of other things to potentially address this in a different way, but that is the concept of shepherding. Like I said, we're not considering that at all under a pilot program. We're working on ways that maybe we can do a conservation program without shepherding. Those are still questions we need to answer. We know that abandonment is a big concern, so part of any legislation would have to alleviate the concern of abandonment for a participant. Also, the export statute. We would have to maybe have some provisions to exclude potential projects from export statutes. We're also trying, as you all know, we're working with Bureau of Reclamation. We currently have state contracts in Fontenelle. We're investigating whether we can get more storage in Fontenelle. How would Fontenelle fit into a conservation program? And then how would our accounts fit within the conservation program? We'd likely need some rulemaking authority for the state engineer. And then do we put a time limit on this program, this pilot program? And are there any other reporting requirements that the legislature would like to see from a potential program? So we're thinking that this is kind of the framework for what the legislation could look like prior to the 2026 session. Mr. Chairman, we covered a tremendous amount. I think it was important to show why we're doing what we're doing, and I hope we did convey that. But we also understand that we have a tremendous amount of work to continue to do to establish this pilot program. But I do think that it is a very good first step in hopefully trying to keep this Colorado River out of litigation. And this is something that I think that the state of Wyoming could look at.
Thank you, gentlemen. So trying to sort out what we should do here. It's been a long 3 days. We got some questions. You do. All right. Senator Boner, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just can you give us a little brief overview of what other states are doing along? Are they also looking at this for voluntary conservation, or are we the only ones discussing this?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Boner, we're at varying degrees of addressing this. And I would say that New Mexico and Utah are ahead of us. The state of Utah just weeks ago approved actual projects for a pilot demand management program in the state of Utah. They've already granted the state of Utah state engineer the authority to even shepherd that water. So they're ahead of the game. The state of New Mexico is also has provision. In New Mexico, they've got a little bit easier row to hoe in that they've got a lot more homogeneous use and a lot fewer users, right? The state of Colorado is probably a lot closer to the same boat that we're in trying to navigate the issues. How do you deal with this idea of conservation in the doctrine of appropriation? Where I can tell you we're all at is that all 4 upper division states put forth the idea of voluntary conservation as part of what we can do to be part of the solution. And so we're a little bit disparate, I guess, with regard to where we're at in the process, but we have all put forth that being part of our solution. But I would suggest Utah and New Mexico are perhaps a little bit ahead of us as far as having something established.
Other questions? Yes. Representative Chestic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Both of you use the term shepherding, and again, I'm new to this. Somebody describe to me what shepherding is?
So, Mr. Chairman, shepherding is just the idea that, so you remember on Tuesday, we talked about the idea of beneficial use is the basis, the measure, and the limit of the right. And if you don't use it, you have no right whatsoever. Now we're talking about voluntary conservation, where you're going to voluntarily not use your water. That means I've got no legal protection because you've foregone your right. So the idea of shepherding is somehow giving that protection and past other water users who would otherwise be lawfully entitled to divert it. So I think the easiest way to think about it is storage water. Right? Some folks are entitled to storage water on some stream systems, other folks aren't. Under state statute, hydrographer commissioners, so you've got the natural flow in the stream and then you release storage water on top of that natural flow. Hydrographers have the authority to shepherd that storage water to the head gate that's entitled to it, which means prevent everybody else from taking it. And so shepherding is essentially the practice of preventing others from taking that conserved water. And that creates a whole bunch of complications. And so we're not seeking that now because that simply is too large of a step, I think, from the state engineer's position. And we want to see what we can do without shepherding before. And then there's a whole lot of other questions that have to be answered before that's even a viable option, I think, from the state's perspective.
Other questions? Do we have anyone with their hand up online? Okay, all right. Well, thank you. So we've, I think, got some members of the public that are curious what we're what we're gonna do here. And I'd rather we don't open this up because it's past our lunchtime and it's been long, like I said, long 3 days. And I'm kind of saturated anyway. I think some of us are. I'm guessing you guys are too. Do you have a springboard or a way of emailing, maybe getting some questions answered that our public might have or members of the committee might have later on? I sprung that question on you without asking you ahead of time, but I'm guessing there
So,
might be a
Mr. Chairman,
way.
I think if I'm hearing your question correctly, that if the public has questions on what we're proposing or anybody has questions on what we're proposing, where should they seek those answers? Is that correct?
Correct.
And I would say they can probably just email me or any of my interstate stream staff and we can try to address those. And I would think maybe the best way to handle that would be to maybe collect those as we do that, and then we could present those questions and any potential answers to the committee at the next meeting.
Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, I just might suggest to the members of the public that, of course, and I think Brandon covered it in the slide, that we intend to work with the Colorado River Advisory Committee. Those will be noticed public meetings to work with that committee, so the public is certainly welcome to participate through that process. And we also anticipate having public outreach meetings, which will be noticed. And so certainly invite members of the public within the basin to come to those meetings and tell us whatever they'd like.
And we don't have dates set up. We're working on some dates, but within the next couple of months, we'll be on a road show and we'll have probably more information to present to them than we even did here. So that would be a good place for the public to raise their concerns or ask their questions as well, if they're willing to wait until we have those meetings.
Okay. Do you have an idea when you might have gathered enough information that we'd have an interim bill ready? Would that be the next one's in August and then one afterwards is, oh, it's later, November? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I think our hope is, and our goal will be to provide something draft for the committee to take into consideration at its August meeting.
Okay.
Not anything finally baked, but give you something that's got more based on what information we can collect through our advisory committee and through that public process. We hope to have you something more to look at your August meeting.
Okay. Are we good? JT, Representative Larson, go ahead.
I guess I just have a question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I just have a question about the process. Does Brian, do you need us to do a formal motion for you to get started on drafting, or are you good just to take direction from state engineer to work with him?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I mean, we can do it that way. If there's a direction from the chairman, you know, if a draft is, say, ready before the August meeting, you know, sufficiently in advance that, you know, we'd have time to prepare it, we could do that.
Would you anticipate that we'd have that before the meeting, or shall we just plan on dealing with it then?
Right, Mr. Chairman, our hope and expectation, granted, there's a few things going on, but our hope and expectation is to have something in writing for you to consider at that meeting,
Okay.
before the meeting.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, sounds like either way, I mean, we can authorize the draft now, even if it's not ready by August, we can authorize that now. So I guess I'll make that motion, then we authorize also to work with our state engineer to, and we got a general overview of what that legislation would entail. I think it's pretty good, but to work with the state engineer to get a bill draft ready. And if it's by August, it's by August. If it's by November, it'll be by November, but we might as well get going on it now. So that's the motion.
Okay, seconded by Larson. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that motion passes. So is there any further business?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just one right here, Mr. Chairman, sorry. One matter of housekeeping, if the committee would entertain a motion on approving the minutes from the committee's March meeting.
Do we have such a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Boner, seconded by Chestic. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? The motion passes. Thank you. Any further business? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you, gentlemen.